Welcome to Backroom Talk.
So patterns and pacing, that's the two P's. That's our topic for the week.
Yeah, in general, it is long to slow or easy to harder. You have a lot of experience in the squat and strength endurance, and you've mastered that mixed cyclical. And now you can start playing with adding that pattern to your mix work.
If we start to think about patterns and pacing and use that in our communication to the general public, it gives us the opportunity to maybe help a bunch more people.
To listen to more Backroom Talk, be sure to subscribe. Learn to design personalized programs with the OPEX system of coaching by heading to opexfit.com.
Well, guys, welcome to another episode of Backroom Talk, and I have an article to share with you, Carl. And I chose this one based on a bit of a conversation we had off camera after last week's episode. We started that conversation around like busyness and people just being obsessed with being busy.
Yeah.
And I was scrolling through, Apple News, and this article popped up, why Nike and its CEO are focusing on mental health. And it's just a short read from John Donohue, or Donahoe, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, but the CEO, Donohue, the CEO of Nike. And he's just kind of written this open letter about, why employees and corporations need to prioritize mental health. And he talks about, being young in the industry and working in a pressured environment and the stress around that, and getting some really great advice. I think at like some kind of consultant training program to actually look after oneself and consider yourself like, he draws the analogy of a professional athlete, which makes sense for someone coming to Nike to draw that parallel. Yeah. But, for time that's spent on the field, like for every hour spent on the field, there's 20 hours of prep work and training and sleep and hydration and just like good lifestyle that goes into an athlete being able to perform. And so someone that wants to perform in a corporate environment or in their career needs to look after themselves too. And it's not just about time put in at the office, it's about all of that time outside of it that makes someone, be able to be successful and thrive. And, beyond that, he is just talking about, having good practices around nutrition and sleep and spending time with one's family and, making time to exercise. And that's a big point at the end of the article around reconsidering the way we think about sport and thinking about movement instead. So like yoga and walking and all of this other great activity, making that, physical pursuits that we really try to focus on and treat like we would, again, if we were a professional athlete. So, long way of saying, I'd love your thoughts around the message that John is putting out and what you think about it.
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, you hear a lot of executives talking about this now, and every book you read on leadership and all of that, it hits on like, balance and this and that. But the difficult thing is and I don't know what Nike's doing to implement this, but the difficult thing is it's like, how do you actually do it? It's one thing to talk about it, but it's another thing to actually do it and then to like make sure it's being done inside of your organization. So I think that's the challenging thing for a lot of people, because I think most people feel that way. I think most people feel the way that he feels. But I think when corporations get in trouble is when they do want to implement something like this, right? Like this like holistic work environment and balance and this and that. And then there's this weird thing of like, we have to be profitable, right? Especially if they're if they have stakeholders, right? And they have a board and they have investors, and it's like, we have to show profit and we have to show this happening to those people that we're responsible to, right? Especially with these public companies. So that gets in the way, and it should, right? Like they're a public company, they're funded, so on and so forth. So that's where it gets tricky. It's like, how do you find balance in making money and everyone being happy and living a fulfilled life and doing movement and, every hour you spend on the field, you spend 20 hours preparing for that. It's like, what does that actually look like in a work environment? We didn't spend 20 hours preparing for this conversation, right?
I've been preparing my whole life for this conversation, Carl.
Yeah, so I get where he's coming from, but and I didn't read the article, so he may have given some ideas on how to implement something like this, and your organization, or maybe this was just from his standpoint and it was like, hey, this is what we do. But that's what I think. That's where the missing link is for a lot of these big companies. It's like at the end of the quarter, are they profitable or are they hitting their targets? So you can say that in January, but end of April starts to roll around and it's like, okay, we were a little bit too balanced for the last 2 months. We need to meet these quotas. Now we're going to go hard. So we're going to like leave those things behind for an amount of time, which I think is actually fine, right? It's like, it's rhythm, that's how life is. Sometimes we're working really hard. Sometimes we're playing really hard. Sometimes we're just like rolling in the middle and have a nice balance of each. So I like it. And I hope more executives start to push this stuff out. I know we talked about like the Elon Musk thing where he's like pushing out, 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night and his employees have to be on call, 24 hours a day just in case he wants to hold an ad hoc meeting or something like that, right? So I like this message more than I like that message. But yeah, I think seeing it play out is the difficult thing.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to change culture as well. And corporate culture for so long has been around that like hustle, work hard, put your hours in, more time, harder work equals better results mindset. So that doesn't just change overnight because we worked from home for a while and like enjoyed going for bike rides outside.
Yeah.
You don't just change company culture like that. So he doesn't actually give any really great suggestions for how to implement any of this in a corporate environment. So I think that's kind of telling, right?
Yeah. And they may be, they're Nike, right? It's like their resources are almost unlimited. So I'm sure they're doing some things to ensure those things are implemented if that's what, he wants the company to do, and that's the vision he has for the company. But yeah, that's the challenging thing. It's like what you said, each individual inside of a company, especially a company like Nike where, you talk about us, we're like a dozen. You look at Nike, they're like thousands of employees, right? Like their campus is absolutely massive. So it's like each one of those thousands of employees are all different people that have different backgrounds, and they're not all aligned with Nike's purpose. They're not. It's impossible, right? Like the organization is just too big. So, he can say these things and it's like, this is what I want Nike to be. But those thousands of employees are going to determine who Nike really is, like culture wise. So it's difficult, right? It's difficult to change all of those hearts and minds. So that's what I'm really interested in. It's like, what are they doing to do it?
Yeah. Do you have any advice? Like, I'm sure there's some gym owners that are listening in that work with small teams and they're thinking about how do I create a healthy environment for my team to make sure that they're looked after, that they are finding purpose in their job, but they're also, not working crazy hours and getting coach burnout like we talked about last week. So any gems there?
Yeah, no, I think, the gym owner, the business owner needs to be really clear on, who they are and what their purpose is. That needs to have at least some synergies to what the business's purpose is. And then from there, the person has to practice what they preach all the time. Like imagine if you had a coach and your coach is always telling you to do this thing. And your coach is like, let's get really specific. It's like, hey, Georgia, every human being needs to sleep at least 7 hours a night. And your coach is telling you that. And you come to realize that your coach sleeps 5 hours a night, 3 times a week. Like when they tell you that like line that you need to sleep 7 hours, every human needs it, it doesn't mean much when it comes from that person anymore because they don't practice that thing. So imagine that same coach owning a business and having coaches underneath them, and he or she is preaching these things and they're not living up to those things, right? Imagine us saying like, you need to move every day. And well, imagine me saying that, right? And I never move, right?
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, no, you know what I mean? Like that would be weird, right? So it's like you have to practice what you preach. And then the next layer to that is you need to find people, coaches, employees that vibe well with that purpose and you and your personality and all of that, because like we just said with Nike, like every person is so different. You can't just like fit that round, is it round peg into a square hole or whatever?
Square peg into a round hole, I think.
Why doesn't it go the other way?
I think it's that way though.
I'm going to use the other way.
No, because, well, Let's not try and work
Same
this out
size.
right now.
Same size. Okay.
Okay.
Well, you can't fit that thing into that thing if it doesn't fit, right?
Yeah.
So, let's say that we're trying to hire, we tried to hire, someone on the marketing team, and we go out and we talk to dozens of candidates. We're going to choose the candidate that we think fits the most culturally, all things being equal, versus the candidate that doesn't fit culturally but has great skills on the marketing side. We're always going to say better cultural fit, they'll grow within the position. We'll say that all the time. So coaches, when they own a business and they're bringing in coaches underneath them, they have to think about that. It's like, who are we? Who do I want this business to be? And that person needs to fit well culturally. And then you teach them all of the things like program design and, communication skills and all of that stuff. So, I think the business needs to be really clear on what their purpose is. The coach owner needs to be really clear on what their purpose is, has to have connections to the businesses, and then they have to find the right people to fit inside of that organization. Then they have to practice it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Carl.
Yeah, for sure.
You want to talk about some fitness stuff?
Yeah, let's do it.
So patterns and pacing. That's the 2 Ps. That's our topic for the week.
Oh, is that a thing now?
I don't
2 Ps?
think it is. I don't think if it's not more than 3, you can't give it a number in front of it. It's got to be at least 3.
I don't think we have any more inventory to use, like 2 this, 3 this, 4 that. I think we're out.
We have a lot of those.
I think there should be like a rule of like you could only have like 3 of those things. Once you use your 3, like you have to trade them in.
It just becomes confusing. 4
Yeah.
C's, 3 P's, 3 O's.
Now 2 P's. We don't really use.
We don't really use that.
Yeah, O cubed we used to
O
use,
cubed.
but yeah. Emma's like, please, no, not another one. Emma,
No
2
more.
P's.
We think that they're really smart. Everyone else thinks it's dumb.
Yeah.
So
Patterns and pacing.
patterns and pacing.
Yeah,
What do those 2 words mean?
Yeah, so patterns, that's functional movement, right? It's like the functional movement patterns. And when we break those down, and we've beat this one up over the past, couple months, but it's the 6 functional movement patterns, right?
What are they? I don't remember.
Squat, bend, lunge, push, pull, and core. Squat, lunge,
we
push,
go.
pull, and core.
What about carries?
That would fall inside of core.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We get that question
I know,
a
I know.
lot. So
What about those?
what about hinging?
Yeah, what about hinging? We call that bending. We never say, hey, I need you to go ahead and hinge over. We say bend over.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a functional. Hinging is unfunctional. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to get annihilated because I know it's a
It's a
thing. Yeah. So hinging's not wrong. We just call it bending.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's those are patterns. So it's performing those in a gym environment, in a home environment, in whatever environment with load, without load. They're just natural human patterns. And then pacing, that's breathing work, just aerobic work.
Fast, slow, anywhere in between?
Whatever you can pace, right? So, if you can repeat those things, that's pacing.
What is the reason for having those 2 things inside of a fitness program, and why are they important?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the conversation of resistance training and aerobic work. This is just a different way of saying it. So in resistance training, there's a lot of really good things that come along with that. Everyone should have the ability to perform all of these patterns effectively. And when we start to look at, I know we'll get into progression, but when we start to look at what does it mean to do these things effectively, that just depends based on who you are. I had a conversation. I was training with one of my neighbors in my garage last week, and we were talking about patterns. And he had a question on okay, because he was overdoing goblet squats or something like that. And he asked me, he's like, okay, so I noticed that you're going and your hamstrings are touching your calves. Should that be the case for me as well? And I was like, not necessarily. You go as far down as you can with keeping really good positions. I don't get extra points because my hamstrings touch my calves. And then we started talking about patterns, and he's like, okay, well, why is it okay for me to go to where he was going to about parallel?
Yeah.
And I'm like, his name's Eric. I'm like, Eric, so just imagine, right? What is the number one, think about it. What's the number one cause of older population individuals going into nursing homes? And he knew the answer. He's like, it's around they're not able to take care of themselves. They can't use the bathroom. They can't squat down onto the toilet, right? Little things like that. And I'm like, that's all it is, man. It's you should be thinking your squat for you He's like mid 40s, right? So he's getting up there. Just kidding. So I'm like, for you, it should be delaying that, right? It's like, you want to be able to, without assistance, sit down in your toilet and take a shit until you're 95 years old. And he's like, oh my God, I never thought about working out in that way. And it's like, yeah, you're just trying to hold on to the capabilities that you have right now as a 45-year-old that has done a lot of training in your life. It's like, you're not coming over here to get a lot better. You're coming over here to hang on to those capabilities. So I thought that was an interesting back and forth around like, patterns. And that's what came to my mind. We were like, why is it important? So patterns are important because we have to be able to do functional things in life on a day-to-day basis, and adding resistance training to that can extend it.
Yeah.
And then pacing, gosh, yeah, doing normal things on a well, not normal things for a lot of people, doing things that human beings are built to do, like breathing for a long period of time under some kind of distress, is an important ability to have. And for some people that's walking up 6 flights of stairs when the elevator's out. For other people, that's going on a long 30, 45-minute hike with their family and not thinking twice about how difficult it is, and being able to lift their heads up and really enjoy the scenery around them. For others, it's the challenge, right? Like some people like that progressive aerobic work. They really like to challenge themselves. They like the high they get from the aerobic work. Some people like to go on really long runs. Some people like to go on a track and run 400-meter repeats. Some people like to do biker repeats, right? It's like all that stuff would fall under pacing.
Yeah, I think we take it for granted, the ability to go on a 30-minute walk, or, stand up off the toilet and not have to think about it, and like brace and, use a bar to have to help ourselves up. But that's not the norm.
Nope.
It is not normal to hang on to patterns and pacing into, I don't want to even say later years, like into your mid years.
Yeah.
I look at my in-laws and my own parents, and, getting upstairs, walking upstairs, the like kind of 1-2 shuffle where it's like one leg comes up, then the other one, then the hands go to the knees, and then they extend their hips and knees to stand all the way up. Like that's how they get upstairs. They can't lunge anymore. Mm-hmm. The ability just to go on a walk, to the shops, around to the local shops, and like feel good about that, and not arrive like a sweaty, just distraught mess because you've gone to walk like 15 minutes uphill. Like that, we just lose those abilities, and it really bums me out. And I think what we're going to get into is that organized exercise in some form is important, right? Around patterns and pacing. There has to be some thought process and organization and structure around it, but it doesn't need to be as complex or as crazy as a lot of people think either.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to talk about function, but I think if we look at it in that way, if everyone looked at it in that way specifically for them, and where they want to see themselves in those mid to later years, I think it just connects a lot better. I was walking. It was when we all met for dinner the other night at the quarter. We were walking through the quarter, and there was this older couple. Not that old, actually. It's probably like, mid 60s, maybe pushing 70. And it was a husband and wife, and the husband was like walker. Like it was difficult, right? Like it was pretty crowded there that night, and he was in front of us. And it was like one of those things where you don't want to be rude and like, bully your way around, because it's like, get out of my way. So it was like we had to walk behind them for like 2 or 3 minutes. And I thought just seeing that, I was like, gosh, I don't ever want to be in that situation. You know what I mean? So for me, when I think about patterns and, extending out capabilities for a long period of time, it's like, I want to be able to take care of myself, right? And I'm not like putting people down that are using walkers and stuff like that. That's reality for a lot of people. But I don't want it to be reality for me, right? So it's like, I think, right, things change, right? Like you grow, you adapt and things like that. But I think right now, sitting here, for me, I never want to experience that. I'd rather be dead, right, than to experience not being able to walk a city block, in a decent amount of time without assistance. So yeah, that's what function, I think, will mean to me as I hit that age. But I got to experience it before I can say that for sure.
Definitely. I just think the fitness industry in general has done a whole lot of people a disservice, because they've made exercise feel more unreachable, more intense, more scary, more intimidating, more connected to like going into the gym and like doing that heavy back squat.
More complicated as well.
So much more complicated than it really is. But the thing that I love about language is the ability to use it to communicate ideas to people and meet them where they're at. And I love the words patterns and pacing, because I think that if coaches start to use this vernacular, use these words to communicate exercise to their clients versus like going on the assault bike or, you know, doing dumbbell lunges, which like, what does that even mean, right? If we start to think about patterns and pacing and use that in our communication to the general public, it gives us the opportunity to maybe help, you know, a bunch more people not have to be on a walker earlier than they would otherwise, because they're like, patterns and pacing is just a thing that I do.
Yeah. It's life, right? It's like we're always, you know, utilizing obviously basic human patterns on a daily basis, and we should have pacing challenges in our lives as well. You know, whether that's a walk, bike ride, hike, gym setting, whatever it is, like that, all that stuff is pacing, right? Like your intention going into that activity is, I want to be able to do this thing effectively over this period of time. So there has to be some thought going into that. At what speed do I do it? Right? Like I think a lot of people think about that. Like imagine being with, you know, 5 or 6 friends and you're about to attack this like hike, this leisurely hike. There's a lot of like figuring it out going on as you're starting like that first 100 meters of like, okay, what's a pace that everyone can sustain? Because we know this is going to be a 2-hour leisurely hike. Like, what does leisurely mean for this entire group? And if it was at like person number 1's leisurely rate, that might leave person number 5 way behind, right? So it's like there's always that like pacing strategy that happens in those scenarios, and then you bring it to a gym setting, and it's really obvious, right? It's like, I have a 1,000-meter row. At what pace am I going to do this? Because I have 10 of them. Right. So I don't think a lot of people think about the indirect pacing strategies that happen in leisurely activities, but it does.
That description of the hike pacing is every single walk that I take with my husband, Jacob. I am a very fast walker, and he is a stroller for sure. He loves to take things nice and easy and slow. And so the first, like from our front door out to like past the mailbox, it's like me going and him being behind and us like having to meet each other somewhere in the middle.
We did that. We did like a 2-mile walk in the desert behind our house early this morning, and it was that. I mean, it's like 2 kids, a dog, Janice, and it was like, okay, who's going to be the slowest? And yeah, it's always Colton, actually, my oldest. He's always just, because he's cool, right? Yeah. So he's like, yeah.
Swaggering
I'm
along.
like, bro, come on, man. Like, come on. The Carson's just like, he'll get left behind and then just sprint up to the top. But yeah, pacing.
Let's talk about general principles of progression around both patterns and pacing.
Okay.
Which one do you want to start with?
Let's do patterns first. Yeah.
Patterns. Yeah. So progressing patterns. What does that look like?
Yeah. I think when we look at progression and patterns, we always have to look at, again, what's the end goal? Because we could easily say what we say in CCP with like motor control, the strength, endurance, and max contractions. But for a lot of people, that's not their goal, right? Like they don't care about max contractions. I would argue everyone should care about strength, endurance. We'll get into that in a second. Yep. But I don't think everyone should be like, okay, I need to lift heavy loads. That's just not for everyone. And, you know, I think relatively tough contractions for everyone is really good, but maybe not 1-rep maxes. So I think we have to start with that, where it's like, you know, the function conversation and your goal conversation and all of that, and then understanding if there's discrepancies in any of those patterns and what those discrepancies are. And obviously we do that through a movement screen, but there's other ways to do it as well. I mean, you can take someone on a gym floor and know nothing about, you know, FMS or, you know, any kind of movement screen or OPEX move or anything like that. And you can just have them do some patterns and understand what they're capable of and what they're not capable of, as long as, you know, those patterns are unloaded and they're in a safe environment. So you have to start there. It's like, what are their goals and what are their capabilities within each of those patterns? And then from there, when you start looking at, okay, I want to progress this. Let's say they check the box and they're like, okay, I can do all of these things effectively. Now it's like, well, let me start with the other one. Let's say they don't check the boxes and they can't do those things effectively. Now it's organizing a plan around how do I get them to bend over and touch their toes effectively. And we won't go into that, but that's where progression starts for patterns. It's just being able to do them. Then once you check the boxes and you're like, okay, I can do all these things effectively. Now it's like, okay, I want to perfect those patterns, right? So we call that motor learning. So I want to perfect the bend, the squat, all of that, right? So you perfect it by learning, right? So you can do that in the gym. You could do that out of the gym. You could do that with resistance. You could do that without resistance. All that means is you're just learning the pattern by itself, right? So you're doing the pattern slow. You're doing it controlled, blah, 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 right? So let's say you do that for an amount of time. And then it's like, okay, what do we do next? Now it's like you just continue to do that and you add some load. Because you're adding load, speed is going to increase, right? Because now they learn the pattern effectively. Speed increases and they're going to do not more volume necessarily, but let's call it more tonnage, right? Because they have more intensity through the load on the bar or in the dumbbell, the kettlebell, whatever the case is. They're moving a little bit faster. They might be doing the same the same volume, but the challenge is more because the intensity is more. So now we start to do faster contractions and we start to feel those like that burning sensation, and it almost feels like we're like organizing pacing inside of a resistance movement by itself, right? So that's what we would classify as strength endurance, right? So it's like you're doing it to grow the muscle, or you're doing it to be able to do more density of that movement, and try to extend that out to the right and, get some faster recovery, so on and so forth. And then we talked about the max contraction piece would be the next one. So it's like lifting heavy loads, and like really expressing within that pattern. Not everyone has to go there, but once you check the box on, okay, I've been working on strength endurance for an amount of time, that's good enough for a lot of people, which we'll get into in the organization and the progression of pacing. But once you get to that strength endurance piece and you've been doing that for an amount of time, that's where you can start to get creative with patterns.
Yeah. Okay. And the max contraction, something like a 1RM, not everyone has to go there. What are some reasons why you would take someone there?
Yeah, I mean, a physical challenge, right? So there's a lot of learning that can take place by lifting heavy weights. There's some discrepancies that can show by lifting heavy weights as well. There's some really good hormonal things that happen when we lift heavy weights. The thing is that we shouldn't do those things all the time, because we start to get into like, nervous system fatigue, and recoverability becomes more difficult. So we just don't want to do that too often with a lot of people. And with heavy loads and 1 rep maxes and stuff like that, there's not a lot of carryover from doing that thing specifically. For someone that's, general population and they don't care what their 1 rep max back squat is, what's the difference between a max contraction, quote unquote, of a 1 rep max versus just a tough 5 for the day relatively for that person? Those can both actually be max contractions for those people. And then as we start to decrease the volume where it's like 4, 3, 2, 1, now we're getting really closer to that like maximum physical expression within that max contraction. But a max contraction can be tough 5s as well.
Yeah, less emotional attachment there as
Yeah.
well. I think, gosh, a lot of this comes from coaches putting it on their clients and attaching a lot of value to that 1 rep max number. But that can actually become a really stressful experience for people and take away from their enjoyment of exercise.
Yeah, I think if we look at goal being sustainability and patterns, so being able to hold on to those patterns and do them for the rest of your life, and it's always beneficial to look at like the most like polarized example of things, because it just kind of like puts you back to reality. And when I think about that as it relates to patterns, I think about powerlifters, like the best powerlifters in the world. It's very difficult to think about someone that has been at the top of the game in powerlifting that has had longevity, right? Where it's like that person set a world record at 28, and at 68, they're still strong and their joints are still good. They're really healthy, all of that, right? So that's such a polarized example. But I just think about that. It's like if you're chasing the 1 rep max, there has to be a reason to chase that 1 rep max. The powerlifter that set a world record when they were 28, They're 68. They may not be able to walk, but they might, if they did it over, they might do the same thing because they're like, hey, my goal was to set that world record when I was 28. That's why I think it's really important to set like that baseline. What are your goals and where are you trying to go with this thing? Because if someone doesn't say, I want to set a world record when I'm 28, I just want to do this when I'm 68, it's so much easier to explain to them why pushing the limits in 1 rep maxes 3 times a week for 10 years is probably not a good idea for them because they're not going to be able to do that until they're 68 years old.
Yeah. Okay. Pacing. Let's go general principles of pacing and how we progress that. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is we start long and slow.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's capable of going long, it might be starting slow and then building long well for a lot of people who don't have the ability to go out and do a nice leisurely 60-minute walk yet. And then over time, increasing speed and increasing pace.
Yeah, in general, it is long to slow or easy to harder, right? Whatever that means. But easy to harder is more important than long to short. The reason being is because of what you said. So let's say MAP 10, right? Like we classify MAP 10 as really easy aerobic work that you can do for hours and hours and hours. What if someone can't do anything for hours? Like what if someone can't go outside and take a walk for hours? Then that progression looks a lot different for them. So the progression for them is there's 2 parts to it. Part number 1 is I want you to go from 5 minutes walking to 2 hours of walking. That's progression number 1. So when we look at, what kind of aerobic work that is using our language, that's a very long MAP 10 progression because we need them to walk for hours. Okay. We're 3 years down the road, right? Maybe not that long for some people, but we're 3 years down the road. They went from 5 minutes walking to 2 hours walking. Now we can start to think about, long to short because now they can go long. But you have to be able to go long before you can progress from long to short. I think a lot of coaches, when they think about MAP 10 to 1, the progression of like hours of work to 30-second intervals, they think, I'm going to do MAP 10 in like a 15-minute block at the end of training, and that'll be my MAP 10 work. And I'm just going to tell them in language like, this is like cool down effort, go really slow, blah, blah, blah. And then they might try to progress them down to MAP 9, and it's like, you have to understand if that person can actually do work for hours first before you even start to think about progressing them down. So I think we have to think about it those 2 ways. But I think the most important thing is that you can do work for hours.
Yeah.
Like that can be someone's progression for the rest of their life, and that's really good aerobic work.
Yeah, I mean, you think about what people typically need to do in breathing and in work in their daily lives, and it is that ability to like go for a walk and not have to think about it versus how often do we really need to sprint and go really fast? Not often at all. Maybe there's an emergency scenario. They're going to figure it out if they need to, But first of all, let's make sure we give them that ability to do that amount of work and don't skip that step.
Yeah, to make people really comfortable. If you're sprinting for your life, usually it's from an animal. We're not faster than those animals that we're sprinting from, so I don't care who you are, you're going to get caught.
Thanks, Carl. That was really heartwarming. I feel so much better about all the aerobic work I do.
It's true. Yeah, it's the truth, though. It's the truth.
Yeah.
I won't get into that. There's a funny story not funny story. That's a bad, terrible way to put it. There's a story, like this thought on like human evolution and what we were meant to do in aerobic work and why we sweat and blah, blah, blah. And it was actually to chase down prey because we're not fast enough to really catch them, but we can out-endure them. So that's like that's why we sweat the way that we sweat. That's why we're not that's why we don't have a bunch of fur on us. Well, some people, we don't have a bunch of fur on us. And it's like we have that regulation of temperature better than a lot of animals. It's so we can out-endure them. But it's not to save our lives, it's to eat.
Interesting.
But you look at, evolution and our lack of need of doing those things over so many years, so many centuries. And humans, I don't want to say all humans, most humans don't have that capability anymore. Most humans don't have the ability to run for 25 minutes without stopping at a slow pace. So if we were out like catching food right now and let's say we see a coyote, and we're like, yep, that coyote looks delicious. It's like what we would have done, thousands of years ago is we would have just been like, okay, boom, let's go. We're going to just jog at this coyote on this open plain or in this desert. And eventually this coyote is going to have to stop because they cannot regulate their temperatures. Then we're going to catch that coyote and then we're going to kill it and we're going to eat it. Most people can't run for those 25 minutes anymore. So we're losing that.
I think we could do it. I think that should be part of our, whatever our OPEX physical fitness test ends up being. I think we should go out in the mountains, find a javelina or a coyote and just chase it.
I'll go coyote over javelina. We had this conversation on our walk this morning. Carson's like, what smells worse, a coyote or javelina? And I'm like, not even a contest. No. It's a javelina.
They're disgusting.
Things are disgusting.
Ooh, so gross. Okay.
Sorry.
So
pacing,
back to pacing. So we've talked about going easy to potentially harder over time. If someone can, going longer to slower, so long as they build up that base of volume at that slow pace. We're talking about cyclical efforts now.
Yep.
So we're talking about spinning on a bike, going for a walk, doing a row, and that is the initial progression.
Yep.
What happens next?
Oh, man. I don't know, Georgia. I don't know what happens next. Theoretically, what should happen next is, again, has to be based on what that person wants to do, because I don't want to lay out, and I just want to be like very particular about this. I don't want to lay this out as like this is a progression that everyone has to go through, because someone can progress cyclical work over time for the rest of their lives. And what progression means is just keeping it up, right? Just doing it. So it's like what we talked about with that 5-minute walk to 2-hour walk. Progression for that person might be, one day I want to walk 5 hours straight, right? And like you can train, quote unquote, to do that for a really long time. So it might just be cyclical for some people. But if we lay this out in terms of like what should it be before you go to the next thing, it's like you should be able to pace effectively and know your gears cyclically before you do anything else. So what does that mean? It's like, again, we go out on that 2-hour hike. Do you understand your 2-hour gear? Do you understand what pace you should go at that 2-hour gear? We're doing 500-meter row intervals. Do you understand your gears as it relates to 500-meter row intervals? And I'm not saying everyone has to row, but just as an example of about 2 minutes of work, do you understand your 2-minute gears? So get really good at that cyclically. So cyclical work could look like walking, hiking, biking, swimming. That's more difficult for most people. Swimming.
I'm like a fish in the water, Carl.
Can you go for 2 hours straight swim?
No, I don't know. Probably not.
Okay. If you ever want to try it, I'll watch you.
Yeah, we'll try it.
I can't do it.
In Idaho.
I will sink. Skipping, like anything, right? Like that would all be considered cyclical activity. So once you have mastered your gears, that long to short, if that's the progression you're going into, or that just long piece, if that's the only type of work you're going to do, that's fine. The next thing would just be mixed cyclical. So now you're perfecting your gears on different like implements or in different scenarios. So if you're walking, biking, swimming, it's like you've perfected your gears in walking, biking, swimming, right? Like all independently. And then once you've mastered that, now you can do them all together, right? Like for inside of a training session. In a gym, it's like if you're rowing, you're bike erging, and you're running, right? Like you've mastered all of those things before you try to like organize all of them together. So just be mixed cyclical activity, or that could just be like assault biking and jump roping, or running and jump roping. So just little things like that.
Yeah. And why you wouldn't go straight to mixed cyclical, why you keep it isolated, just rowing before we go row bike ski together. Those row bike ski, they're all going to have a slightly different dose. There's a different, turnover that's happening on each piece of equipment. It's just more to organize your brain around when it comes to pacing.
Yeah, every cyclical endeavor has its own specific contraction type and rate to it. So ski erging and rowing, let's actually go way different. Ski erging and bike erging, those contraction types and rates are so different. If you got really good on the ski erg and you're like, okay, now I can do anything cyclically and I can like pace it and I know my gears, you're going to get on the bike erg and you're like, what's this feeling in my legs? I'm not used to this because I'm used to doing this motion. So every cyclical endeavor has a different contraction type and a different contraction rate. Most cyclical endeavors are very lower body dominant, outside of the ski erg, but probably not a very functional movement for a lot of people. I just think it's a nice machine and a good change up. But most cyclical endeavors are lower body dominant. So yeah, just understanding your gears on each one of those things before you can like do them interchangeably is really important.
Gosh, even going like assault bike to bike erg, which you're like, that should be fairly similar. They're both
way
bikes.
different. Way
so
different.
different. We've experienced that now that we have the bike erg to
Yeah,
use.
yeah. You're like, blood never leaves my quads when I do this bike erg thing. So you have to adapt and get used to that, because there's no like, okay, I need to organize like shuttling lactate on my quads and doing that. It's not that. You just need to utilize the blood that's in your quads effectively. And when you feel that, you have to know everything's going to be okay, and you can actually keep going. So there's a lot to be said in experience, and experiencing those things and just doing them on a non-physiological level. That's really important. So you just have to spend some time on it.
So we have mastered pacing of cyclical and mixed cyclical work. At the same time, in our resistance, we have been mastering the patterns, and we've progressed from motor control to strength endurance. Maybe we've hit some, tough max contractions. What could be happening in the pacing world now?
Oh, you're setting this up so nicely.
What a story.
Yeah, that's when we go to mixed work. Mm-hmm. So just like you laid out in resistance or in patterns, each pattern we're now pushing toward like strength endurance. We've been doing strength endurance for a good amount of time. So we've like not mastered strength endurance, because I don't think there's a such thing, because you do a different exercise within that pattern, and that's a totally different skill to master. But let's say, you have a lot of experience in the squat and strength endurance, and you've mastered that mixed cyclical. And now you can start playing with adding that pattern to your mix work, the squat pattern to your mix work. And now it gets pretty complex, right? Because now we're thinking about what patterns can I do, and how does that cyclical endeavor affect the pattern that I want to do that I think I've mastered. For instance, let's say that squat pattern is the one that you've mastered in strength endurance. You come down into mixed work, and you're pairing that with a bike erg. What did we just say, right? With the quads and all of that. So it's like, can you actually make mixed work with bike erging and squatting aerobic? Probably not, right? Probably not, if this is like the first time you've done those two combinations together. So there's some fun experimenting that you can do with like, okay, I haven't yet mastered this and this, but I have mastered the row and the squat. I have, you know what I'm saying? So it's just one of those things where you play with it, and intentionally, like, we left out like the whole idea of like dynamic activity and all that stuff in this conversation, because there's no utility in it. In reality, there's no utility. I think it's fun. I think it's fun for a lot of people, but when we're trying to when we're putting principles around things, and there's no utility in it, why spend the time, effort, and energy to try to, really understand how to do that effectively with the normal person, if we're saying the normal person shouldn't be doing it? So that's why we're talking about just patterns and not like dynamics.
Dynamics, you mean clean, snatch, any kind of plyometric activity?
Exactly, yeah. Like rebound box jumps and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, let's just not do it, because there's no, the juice isn't worth the squeeze for those things for people.
So we've decided the juice is worth the squeeze, and we are going to put some patterns inside of our pacing work. We're thinking about, first of all, what patterns does that person actually progress through, where they're capable enough to be able to put them in, because it's possible that someone can do that squat pattern, but their push pattern isn't great. And so we're not going to be putting that inside of there. So we need to think about what patterns can that person do. And then secondarily, as we begin to put those patterns into that pacing scenario, we probably want to think about exercises that are complementary, including the cyclical work initially, before we try and make it more complex by going bike erg, goblet squat, and, walking lunge.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what we should do, and like, even because when we get into that mixed work, there's a very long progression of what happens inside of that mixed work. So, we've mastered strength endurance in the squat. now we go down to mixed work and pacing. You're not doing the exact same things that you did to master strength endurance in that pattern in a pacing scenario. So for instance, let's say someone's doing front squats, right? And they're just like, they're hitting 8s, 10s, 12s, and they're like doing those really effectively. They're getting a really good dose, high five, but you're not doing those same things immediately when you go down to mixed work. It's almost like a regression in terms of exercise selection, and it's not because they're not capable of doing those things. They're not capable of doing those things with everything else going on. And I would argue that it isn't even necessary to like progress all of those movements to the same movements that you were doing in strength endurance. It's okay to, in your mixed work, to do, for the lunge pattern, to just do body weight step ups to 18 inches. And that's like your lunge pattern inside of the mixed work. And then you're doing that with the ski erg, and then you're doing, 10 hand release push-ups. You know what I mean? So I don't think you actually have to progress necessarily the complexity of exercises inside of mixed, because there's no utility in it. Again, it's like if you're trying to get better at patterns, get better at patterns in those on that pattern day. Don't try to get better at patterns in the pacing day. You're just using the things that you're capable of to make your training a little more fun. Because at the end of the day, that's all it really is, right? Because if you're like, I want to have better strength endurance in my squat, and I think that's the excuse a lot of people use as to why they're putting it into pacing work. It's like, just do more reps or more volume in your pattern work. All mixed work is it's entertaining and fun for a lot of us to do.
Yeah.
Myself included. I love mixed work.
Yeah, it's...
But I'm not trying to progress patterns in mixed work.
No, and I think that's where things get muddy, is when you're trying to improve those two characteristics. I want to get better at strength endurance, and I want to get better at aerobics and pacing at the same time.
Yep.
Where ultimately you're going to get a better result if you split them out.
Unless you're a competitor, right?
Yes.
You're like, I have to get better at strength endurance while I'm really tired in like this 10-minute scenario. But regular people don't need, like, I don't need to do that. You don't need to do that.
Yeah. But I guess, point of this conversation was the regular person, and it's okay if you just enjoy it. That's so long as you have the base built up and you've gone through that progression we talked about, there's no harm in doing it.
Yeah, I fucked up yesterday. I did 60-pound front rack 60-pound dumbbell front squats. Like I did, I think it was like 15 of those, and then 10 dumbbell deadlifts, and then 20 jump lunges, and then finishing with a assault bike for like a half a mile. And I did intervals of that, and I was doing like 4 or 5, and I got to set like 3 or 4, and I was like, big mistake. Like, I should have done air squats, or I should have just done like 60 pounds on 120 pounds on the front squat, because I couldn't recover. The 1-to-1 work rest time period just wasn't enough. So I was like very lactic-y at the end of that one. So I definitely messed that one up. But that's the fun thing about mixed work, right? Like, if you know what you're doing, you understand what it should feel like and what it shouldn't feel like. And when you fuck it up and you do something that you shouldn't have done, you learn from it. And the next week you're going to think twice about doing 60 pounds per hand on the dumbbell front squat.
Which is a really good reason why, if coaches are programming this stuff for their clients, that they should get out there and experiment with it and experience it themselves, so they know what that feels like.
Yep, absolutely.
And everyone's going to get a different dose. There's probably someone that could have done their 60 pounds and had no issue at all.
I can think of a lot of people that could have done those 60-pound dumbbells and been completely fine. Just not me on that day.
Well,
not me on that day.
Let's leave it at that, Carl.
Should we
wrap it up right there?
Yeah, that's solid. So to recap, we have patterns and pacing, and there's a time to, marry those things together. But generally and principally, we should keep those things separate for an amount of time until you're able to actually put them together effectively.
Yeah, maybe we go down the rabbit hole even a little bit more of how we blend those together. I feel like we could go real deep there in a coming week. Well, guys, as always, please make sure you do subscribe, leave us a review, and leave us a comment on YouTube. We love to hear from you and get your feedback on what you want to hear about.
Thanks, guys.